Imagine yourself in the countryside of medieval Europe. The last leaves have long since fallen from the trees, and the sun is dipping low on the horizon. Its weak rays are not enough to warm the sharp chill in the air. A light breeze and the first snowflakes are arriving. Winter is coming, and for the people of this era this means one thing: hardship. The cold initially seeps in slowly, but it will remain for long months. The landscape will soon be blanketed in white. Rivers and lakes will turn into sheets of ice. In a time before central heating and well-insulated houses, the promise of warmth is a distant dream for everyone except the wealthy. But of course it wasn't always like this. Medieval winters were not always this brutal. They were not this unforgiving. There was a time when the seasons passed with a more predictable rhythm, where the arrival of snow was met with acceptance rather than fear. But then something changed. The climate itself began to shift, leading to a period known as the Little Ice Age, which would last from the 14th century to the 19th century. Although the causes of this shift are still not fully understood, its impact was felt across all lands. Crops were ruined, animals perished, and the icy winds grew even harsher. One of the most famous examples of the Little Ice Age's wrath was the Great Frost of 1709. That winter, temperatures dropped so low that rivers and lakes froze solid. In London, the River Thames became a frozen thoroughfare where people opened shops and even lit fires on the ice. However, there was a cost. While the world was covered in ice that year, many who gathered in their homes perished from the cold. Yet, amidst all the suffering, there were those who found a strange solace in the freezing weather. One such figure was young Isaac Newton, then a student at Cambridge University. When the Great Frost hit, Newton was forced to return to his family's farm. There, gathered by the fire, he found ample time to ponder the mysteries of the universe. It was during this unexpected hiatus that Newton began to develop some of his most groundbreaking ideas, laying the foundations for calculus and his theories of optics. Who knows what other great minds might have reached brilliance in the silence of a long, cold winter? It reminds us that even in these darkest times, the human spirit tends to seek the light. But for many people in the Middle Ages, winter was a season to be endured rather than enjoyed. The rich could afford thick woolen clothes, plenty of firewood, and well-stocked pantries to survive the lean months. But for the peasants and serfs who made up the vast majority of the population, the situation was very different. Imagine waking up every morning in a one-room hut. The air is thick with smoke from the crackling fire. As you rise from your straw bed, your breath mists before you. The cold seeps in through every crack and crevice, careful not to disturb your shivering family members gathered around you for warmth. It numbs your fingers and toes until they hurt. If you are lucky, breakfast might be a humble bowl of porridge or stale bread. Food remaining from the previous harvest is beginning to run out, and you know the long winter months will only bring more scarcity. The animals suffer too. Their coats covered in frost, they huddle together in the barn, trying to keep warm in the icy air. As the day progresses, you trudge through the snow to gather whatever firewood you can find. It is exhausting work, and your hands quickly become chapped and irritated from the cold. But you know that without fire, your family cannot survive the night. You think of your family. Their faces shrunken from hunger and cold, and you keep going. This was the reality for many in the Middle Ages. A constant war against the elements, a struggle for survival consuming every waking hour, and yet, despite such hardship, moments of resilience and even joy could be found. You see, the medieval world was deeply connected to the laws of nature. The passing of seasons was marked not only by changes in the weather but also by a rich tapestry of rituals and celebrations. That is why, even in the depths of winter, glimmers of light could be found. For a brief moment, the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society would be reversed. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of one's community, the bonds of family and friendship took on deep significance. Imagine a small village covered in snow right now. Smoke rising from chimneys blends with the leaden sky. Inside the houses, families gather around the hearth, telling tales and stories, sharing whatever scraps of food they have on hand. There is a sense of unity here. A sense of common purpose against the hardships. Neighbors trudge through the snow to check on one another. They bring extra firewood or a bit of food to those in need. In the flickering firelight, faces are etched with fatigue but also with a quiet and profound determination. They have survived past winters and they will survive this one too, and so the long cold months continue. The snow piles higher and it intensifies with each passing day. But even in the darkest and deepest depths of winter, there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Because medieval people knew that no matter how brutal the season, spring would surely come again. When the days slowly began to lengthen and the ground beneath the snow began to soften, it was celebrated with a joy and reverence we can barely imagine today. A day when new work could begin in the fields. Seeds that had lain idle for so long were brought out and blessed in elaborate ceremonies. It was a symbol of the renewed cycle of life. When the first furrows of the earth were cut, there was a palpable sense of relief and gratitude in the air. Life was very hard. Yes, sometimes it was very hard, but they endured. They survived the long darkness of winter, the hunger and the cold, and the unknown uncertainty. The people of the Middle Ages held fast to the promise of spring, and now, as the earth began to thaw and green shoots rose toward the sun, that promise was fulfilled. It is a resilience difficult to grasp in our age of modern convenience and comfort. The thought of facing such relentless hardships every year is almost unimaginable. But still, there is something deeply humbling in knowing that our ancestors did exactly that. They faced the brutal reality of their world with a strength and tenacity that was nothing short of remarkable. They found hope in the darkest times and joy in even the simplest things, thus leaving us a legacy of resilience that echoes through the ages. So, the next time you shiver on a cold winter's day, take a moment to remember those who came before you. Remember their struggles and triumphs, their sorrows and joys, and above all, the unbreakable and unwavering human spirit that kept them standing even in the harshest winters. For in the end, this is one of the greatest lessons we can learn from the medieval world. No matter how dark the night or how cold the wind, the promise of spring is always waiting just around the corner. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the brutal winters of medieval Europe. I hope these stories of hardship and resilience have brought a new perspective and hope to your own experiences with the season. May you always find warmth and comfort in the bonds of family and community, just as our ancestors did so long ago, and may the promise of spring light your way even on the coldest nights. When the brutal conditions of winter wrapped medieval society tightly in its icy claws, even the most privileged were not immune to the season's cruel danger. In primitive castles, ill-equipped for the harshest months and drafty, royal households faced a tough struggle to ward off the piercing cold and keep their palaces sufficiently supplied. The logistics of maintaining a royal residence through the winter were nothing short of staggering. Massive amounts of firewood had to be stockpiled to feed the roaring hearths. Kitchen staff worked silently and furiously to preserve meats and provisions to sustain the palace during the long months when fresh food was scarce. Servants strove to seal every crack and gap to keep out the insidious cold. But even the most meticulous preparations often fell short against winter's relentless chill. In one particularly chilling story, it is said that a medieval queen tragically froze to death within the walls of her own palace. According to chroniclers, Queen Islacida of Hungary was found frozen in her bed on a brutal January morning in 1326, a victim of the castle that was supposed to be a sanctuary for her. Such dire fates lurked in the dark depths of winter. However, even amidst such gloom, the human spirit endured and found reason to rekindle hope. For the majority of the population, this faint glimmer came in the form of the feast of Saint Stephen, falling on December 26th. This day marked a brief respite from the endless toil and deprivation of peasant life, a rare, sanctioned opportunity for fun and indulgence. At the center of the feast was the tradition of misrule, a ceremonial reversal of the normal social order. For this one day, a commoner would be appointed the Lord of Misrule. He was granted temporary authority to preside over the festivities and issue playful decrees to his superiors. However temporary, this act of license was of vital importance for the simmering tensions and resentments bred by the oppressive feudal hierarchy. The rigid lines between lord and vassal blurred for a day filled with joy where everyone could participate equally in feasting, games, and entertainment. The sense of community fostered by such celebrations went beyond mere distraction. As the cruelty of winter sought to break both body and spirit, the bonds of brotherhood and goodwill forged during the feast of St. Stephen and similar festivities helped keep the population standing in their worst times. A chronicle from 1377 tells the poignant story of two peasant families whose winter supplies had run out before the arrival of spring. Starving, they pooled their last worn-out resources to share a humble meal on the feast of St. Stephen. This generosity and unity gave them the strength to endure the remaining times and trials of the season. Such acts of compassion formed the essence of medieval society in winter. A helping hand extended to a frozen traveler or an extra log given to a shivering widow could determine the difference between life and death. The brutal common purpose of withstanding winter's assault together shaped a culture of interdependence that defied the often cruel stratification of the era. But even the warmest expressions of friendship and brotherhood would cool inwardly as the misery of winter stretched into eternity. The feast of St. Stephen was just a small glimmer of light and joy amidst the frozen darkness. It was a momentary respite before the bleak, arduous march of the beginning of the year. Even as supplies dwindled, bellies went hungry, and the cold penetrated the most carefully tended hearth, the distant promise of spring seemed to fade into impossibility. But still, medieval society endured undaunted against all odds. It remained determined to survive despite unimaginable difficulties and ordeals. Courage forged in the cruel crucible of winter was found supported by fortitude and brotherhood. While the earth slept and the sun retreated, they somehow found within themselves the resolve and ambition to carry on. We can imagine the profound flood of relief and joy that met the first tentative signs of winter's passing. The slight softening of the freezing air, the gradual lengthening of daylight, and the hopeful dripping of ice yielding to the strengthening rays of the sun. After months of relentless struggle, the sight of the season's first lost battles against the forces of light and life must have seemed miraculous to those who worked the weary land, and indeed it did. No day was more welcome than Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year, falling on the first Monday after Epiphany in early January. It heralded the imminent thawing and reawakening of the earth. Even if winter's deepest hardships had not yet fully released their claws, the ritual preparations of Plough Monday offered a tangible talisman of hope and an assurance of winter's certain loosening and spring's return. As the snow and frost slowly retreated, newly hitched teams of draft animals leaned into the first tentative overturnings of the freezing clods, and medieval man struck another blow against the retreating sovereignty of winter, declaring his stubborn persistence against the whims of nature. We in the modern world, with our central heating and electric blankets, our well-stocked pantries and resilient infrastructure, can barely grasp the immense fortitude required to withstand the relentless savagery of a medieval winter. Even if the impositions of the season now seem daunting to us from the comfort of our temperature-controlled bubbles, consider how incomprehensible true winter suffering must have been. Yet, while we complain about the minor inconveniences of a rain-clogged commute, we would do well to consider the misery our ancestors experienced during those endless frozen months. What reserves of resilience and perseverance must they have had to draw upon just to survive? Their ability to create moments of celebration and camaraderie amidst such relentless deprivation seems almost superhuman to modern sensibilities. That they not only endured the ravages of winter but found particles of light in the all-encompassing darkness speaks to a spirit dormant within us all. After months of relentless struggle and war, the sight of the season's first lost battles against the forces of light and life must have seemed miraculous to those who worked the weary land. But no day was more welcome than Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year falling on the first Monday after Epiphany in early January. It heralded the imminent thawing and reawakening of the earth. Even if winter's deepest hardships had not yet fully released their claws, the ritual preparations of Plough Monday offered a tangible talisman of hope and an assurance of winter's certain loosening and the return of spring. As the snow and frost slowly retreated, seeing newly hitched teams of draft animals leaning into the first tentative overturnings of the freezing clods, medieval man struck another blow against the retreating sovereignty of winter. In the modern world, we can barely grasp the immense fortitude required to withstand the relentless savagery of a medieval winter amidst our central heating, electric blankets, well-stocked rugs, and resilient infrastructure. Even if the impositions of the season now seem daunting to us from the comfort of our temperature-controlled bubbles, consider how incomprehensible true winter's suffering must have been. Let us try to embrace the opportunity to tap into our own dormant reserves of courage and reverence to honor those who came before you, and please, as we curl up in our warm beds with gratitude, let us not forget to think of those who fought solely with will, camaraderie, and undying hope. When the new year arrived and the festivities of Plough Monday faded into memory, medieval life returned to its familiar winter rhythm. The lucky ones retreated to the relative warmth of smoky hovels and drafty manors. For the less fortunate, winter meant a constant struggle with nature for survival. One of the greatest challenges of winter was the constant threat of disease, which could spread like wildfire in the cramped and unsanitary living conditions of the time. The common cold was a widespread affliction requiring stoicism. But more serious illnesses also stalked the population. In an era without vaccines or effective treatments, there was a terrible sickness that seized the young and old with fever, chills, and aches. Epidemics could wipe out entire communities. The winter of the Bayezid era was particularly one of the most brutal. There was a violent strain of disease ravaging Europe. Thousands of lives perished in Istanbul alone, another insidious disease preying on those weakened by hunger or other ailments. Even the royal family was not spared from winter sickness. In fact, because people were constantly coming and going, disease spread even faster in castles and palaces. Thus, a visiting dignitary or pilgrim could unknowingly bring the plague along with their retinue. Henry VIII lost his beloved wife, Jane Seymour, likely due to postpartum complications exacerbated by the era's poor hygiene practices. Children, sadly, were perhaps the most vulnerable. Harsh weather conditions, insufficient food, and unsanitary conditions made winter a truly dangerous time for the young. Babies born in the cold months had a particularly perilous start to life. In London in the 1500s, half of all children did not see their 5th birthday. A poignant practice of the era speaks volumes. The tradition of bone lace involved tying a black ribbon to the hand of a seriously ill baby. If the child died, this ribbon could be used to secure the funeral shroud. It was a grim reminder of winter's deadly toll on the most innocent. As danger lurked both outside and inside the home, winter became a time to pray for protection and survival. For those with limited means, even the most basic necessities like shelter, food, and warmth could not be taken for granted. The icy claw of winter poverty was cruel and merciless. Firewood was a precious commodity, with strict laws regulating the gathering of fallen logs from forests. A peasant family might huddle around a makeshift fire of dried dung and straw, trying to eke out a meager warmth. Shivering animals shared the existing warmth, their breath misting in the freezing air. Food supplies would dwindle to a meager subsistence of salted meat, dried peas, and coarse bread. The bounty of the autumn harvest was a distant memory, and the first tentative greenery of spring was still quite far away. Foraging in winter meant scanning the barren landscape for hardy foods like nettles, garlic, and mushrooms. The scarcity of fresh vegetables in winter resulted in some very dreary and dull dinners. However, it was enough to keep body and soul together until spring. For many, even this unappealing monotony became an unattainable luxury. Storms, droughts, pests, and other disasters could destroy food stores and plunge entire regions into crisis. The Great Famine of 1315 became a particularly chilling time caused by constant heavy rains rotting crops in the fields of northern Europe. It paints a gruesome picture of desperate people reduced to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh out of starvation. It was said that parents eating their starving children was seen as an act of mercy. Corpses littered the streets and fields, too many for proper burial. While this famine was remarkable for its severity and scale, local crop failures and food shortages were a constant threat. It was a time to hole up, knowing things would likely get worse before they got better. Beyond basic survival, winter impacted every aspect of medieval culture. Leisure, religious worship, and even crime and punishment bore the season's distinct mark. The sheer difficulty of barely sustaining existence in the bitter cold colored every aspect of life. Socially, winter was a time to rely on family and community ties and to withdraw indoors. Joyous gatherings around the Yule log were seen as travel was dangerous and scarce daylight led to quieter pursuits. People looked inward for entertainment and enrichment during the long dark evenings. The flickering light of rushlights and tallow candles illuminated scenes of sewing, weaving, and carving. Industry was born of necessity rather than virtue. Winter confinement at least provided plenty of time for such productive activities. For the literate, winter offered the chance to curl up with a good book. But this was a highly prestigious club in England at the end of the 15th century. A humble tradesman's library might boast a Bible, a book of hours, and perhaps some merry jests and Robin Hood stories. But only the wealthy could afford the ostentatious illuminated volumes they valued so highly. The literate often read aloud for the benefit and entertainment of the entire household. Winter was the time to share treasured tales of brave knights, cunning tricksters, and lovers. Chivalric accounts of King Arthur and his court, with their intricate plots and noble themes, were perennial favorites that helped transport listeners far beyond the close confines of their winter shelters. More unwholesome entertainments also aimed to enliven the tedium of winter days. Gambling with dice was a popular pastime. It often led to heated arguments and empty purses. The clatter of bones and the rattle of dice echoed in most taverns and great halls. Money was won and lost. Drinking was also a common winter pastime. Public houses saw great trade. Companionship, entertainment, and a departure from the sharp cold increased the demand for Alesh and other wines. Drunkenness often led to looser tongues and lower inhibitions. It triggered lively debates, bawdy songs, and occasionally a fight or two. The short days of winter were also conducive to quiet reflection and spiritual contemplation. The church had a huge influence on the medieval mind, and winter was a time to draw closer to God. When agricultural work paused, more time could be devoted to prayer and good works. The traditional nativity plays and pageants of the Christmas period gave way to more serious worship as winter deepened. The pious might make pilgrimages to holy sites, enduring harsh conditions as a sign of their devotion and dedication. Others spent hours in churches, praying silently while numb with cold, contemplating their eternal souls. Charity was also an important winter value. Giving alms was seen as a religious duty. Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless, clothing the cold, visiting prisoners, comforting the sick, and burying the dead was a duty. In times of scarcity and hardship, small gestures of humanity could change everything. Of course, the harshness of winter sometimes brought out the worst aspects of human nature. As desperation loomed, crime increased, and with people spending more time indoors, incidents of theft rose. This also led to an increase in assault and other violent crimes. The medieval justice system was ill-equipped to deal with this seasonal surge in lawlessness. Trials were often postponed until the weather improved, causing the accused to rot in damp and crowded prisons. Punishments were quite severe. Fines, floggings, and even executions could be handed down to those found guilty. But despite the bleak realities of winter, the human spirit endured. People found whatever small joys and moments of mirth they could. The distant promise of spring kept them standing through the darkest and coldest nights. The lengthening days of February brought a welcome respite with the feast of Saint Valentine on the 14th. This ancient fertility ritual, transformed into a celebration of love, was embraced with enthusiasm and affection by medieval people. It was a glimmer of warmth and tenderness right in the midst of the depths of winter. The tradition of drawing names for St. Valentine's Day sweethearts was well established by the 15th century. Eligible ladies and gentlemen would gather to draw slips of paper from a bowl, sealing their romantic fates for the coming year. These annual pairings often led to cheerful flirtations and sometimes even marriages. Flowers, sweets, and sentimental verses were common tokens of affection exchanged between Valentine's sweethearts. Even a simple act like receiving a handmade card from an admirer warmed hearts even in the coldest weather. Winter, for all its troubles, could not stop the fires of love. As the feast of Saint Valentine passed into Lent, the harshness of the season intensified. But a feeling was born within them that the worst was behind them and brighter days were approaching. Snowdrops and crocuses pushing their fragile heads through the frost offered proof that winter's icy rain was finally weakening. Throughout the Middle Ages, the rapid cycle of the seasons shaped every aspect of life, and no season left a firmer mark than winter. It was a time of deprivation and hardship. It was a period when survival was an achievement, and yet, even in the face of the harshest elements, it was a time of resilience and quiet struggle. The medieval winter was a test of the human spirit. It was a testing ground for faith, family, and communal values. Twinkling icicles, frozen lakes, and long fallow fields might be as seen as perfect as a postcard. But the realities of the season were anything but picturesque. However, this pit of snow, ice, and deprivation also defeated a people of remarkable courage and endurance. It fell on the backs of those who could withstand the worst conditions winter could offer and still find reason to hope for spring. There is perhaps no greater tribute to their stubborn vitality than this. So the next time you complain about a delayed train or a muddy sidewalk, you should think of your medieval ancestors. Without thermal socks, central heating, or weather apps, they met every winter as a battle to be fought with every resource at hand, and emerged victorious every spring. We are the heirs and beneficiaries of their perseverance and unbreakable spirit. And with that, I leave you to your warm bed and electric blanket. We know that winter has largely been tamed. May your dreams be filled with gentle snowfalls and cozy hearths, and may you wake to a world where winter is a friend rather than a foe. While the weak winter sun struggled to pierce the lead-gray clouds, the people of medieval Europe shivered and clutched their meager cloaks tighter around their shoulders. The icy tendrils of winter seemed to seep into the marrow of their bones, freezing them to the core. For the poorest peasants, the cruel irony was that the worn woolen clothes that felt so oppressive and sticky during the sweltering work of summer now provided little more warmth than a thin veil against the sharp cold of winter. Huddled in their hovels, they shivered gratefully for the scant warmth provided by a smoky fire. Their breath misted in the cold air. Animals felt the cold of winter too. An old horse, bones protruding beneath its shaggy coat, ate its share of a wisp of hay while longing for lush summers long lost. The milk cow lowed sorrowfully, her feet chapped and irritated in the freezing cold leaking through the barn walls. Even the cunning barn cats looked a little less arrogant than usual due to the hunger in their bellies and the frost on their whiskers. Winter was a particularly challenging time for the lower rungs of medieval society. However, even the nobles cocooned in great drafty castles were not immune to the season's deprivations. Many a noble maiden wept in despair, finding her priceless silk dress useless against the damp chill of the stone walls. Castle kitchens struggled to prepare temperatures comfortable enough to warm noble, fine limbs. It is said that when King Henry of England was seized by a violent winter shiver, he burned an entire chair to warm the royal seat for a blessed moment or two. His servants were in despair. They knew His Majesty's patience could ignite as quickly as the uncomfortable arm. But for peasant and king alike, winter seemed to go on for eternity. The relentless hardship of frozen misery. The only respect came in the form of an occasional celebration or feast day. joyful little islands in the dark ocean of winter. People cherished these moments of light and joy like a drowning man gasping for breath. Perhaps the most anticipated was the Feast of St. Stephen on December 26th. An endless joy and delightfully subversive reversal of fortune. According to an ancient tradition, a common peasant would be crowned the lord of misrule on this day, cheerfully ruling over his own superiors as part of a delightfully sanctioned rebellion. The raucous laughter resulting from the lowest man barking orders at the local baron with mocking arrogance can only be imagined. For one glorious day, normal rules and hierarchies vanished, and everyone had quite a lot of fun feasting, gaming, and entertaining. The freezing toil of winter was pushed back, retreating by the bright flame of communal joy. Yet all too soon the merry festivities would end, the wrong would be righted, and the cold and harsh reality of winter would descend once again. People would return to their hearths and their work. People would find themselves again and again on the skirts of the frozen lake. It was hoped that the skirts of the lake in winter would pass more easily with spring. The war against the bleak siege of winter continued relentlessly. But still, even in the bleakest depths of winter, quiet acts of courage and compassion were found in the weariest of hearts. Neighbors shared supplies in scarcity with those even less fortunate. They displayed a generosity of spirit that no condition could diminish. It was said that Dame Matilda of York once gave her only cloak to a poor beggar woman, shivering herself on the long walk home. When asked why she had left herself with her only defense against the bitter cold, she simply smiled coolly and said, "The warmth of human kindness is a fire that never goes out." Such sacrifice, such nobility of spirit, was the secret weapon with which medieval people armed themselves against the relentless siege of winter. For winter might freeze fingers and toes, but it could not touch the invincible summer that reigned eternally in their hearts. And so they endured, so they resisted. In their own way, they achieved victory against the harshest of seasons. The first green buds of spring remained not just a pleasing sight. They were living proof of the persistence of human will, of the spirit that could weather any winter, no matter how dark or cold. The cold winds of winter are still present outside our windows. But if they could brave the relentless cold with only a cloak and inextinguishable human souls, it means we too can stay standing until spring arrives. In the end, spring, when winter's icy claw finally began to loosen, the medieval people waited impatiently and quietly for the return of better weather. Having endured freezing cold for a long time, bellies rumbling with meager winter rations, there was cause for celebration across all lands now that the sun stayed in the sky a little longer each day, shining over the melting snow. People emerged from their winter cocoons and rubbed their eyes in the bright spring light. Bears too woke from hibernation. Children burst from their homes, delighting in feeling the sun on their faces instead of the sharp bite of the winter wind. They ran through the slushy mud with joyful laughter. They marveled at the petals of the first brave crocuses emerging from the melting earth. In the fields, farmers impatiently awaited Plough Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year falling on the first Monday after Epiphany in early January. This marked the moment the ground softened enough to be plowed. Church bells rang joyfully with the passing of the procession. It was a festive start to the growing season ahead. There was a visible sense of relief as chimneys once again puffed smoke. They were no longer clogged with snow and ice. The threat of freezing and disease vanished along with the snowdrifts. Faces wrinkled with worry from the stress of winter's survival now wrinkled with hope-filled eyes and smiles. Soon summer produce would replace the tasteless preserved grains and hard cheese that had barely sustained them through the long dark months. From our modern perspective, it is perhaps very difficult to imagine how significant this seasonal shift was. But for our medieval ancestors, the arrival of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant they had withstood winter's brutal assault, repelling hunger and disease. The skeleton trees turning green once again was an external reflection of the internal regrowth and renewal felt by medieval people as warmth and light returned. Some of that exuberance still echoes in lively medieval folk tunes and poems celebrating the sweet return of spring. Pure irrepressible joy, overflowing in simple but evocative rhyme. So let us spare a thought to appreciate the immense fortitude, resilience, and joie de vivre possessed by our medieval ancestors. Gritting their teeth and bound by their communities, they weathered every winter together despite the hardest conditions imaginable. When the spring sun and birdsong finally broke the oppressive silence of winter, they rejoiced and reveled wholeheartedly, knowing they had once again triumphed over nature's cruelty. As we curl up in our warm beds, perhaps complaining half-heartedly about the cold outside our windows, we would do well to think of those ancient spirits who breathed a deep sigh of relief as the snow turned to mud, opened their shops to let the spring air in, and met the savagery of winter with a perseverance and joy of life that should humble us to this day. The thaw will come, the sun will return, and they will step into the light once more. Blizzards and sharp frosts continued to torture the land. Yet medieval man possessed a stubborn resistance. Even in the darkest depths of winter, they somehow found ways to help each other weather the storm. Neighbors shared appropriate densities of winter supplies they had with the less fortunate. They took turns hosting communal meals. Young men were appointed in villages to check on elderly widows, bringing them firewood and repairing their makeshift huts. One such widow was Agnes. She was an old woman with no one to look after her. Her bones ached violently in the cold, and her hands shook as she tried to light a fire, but in vain. She had almost lost hope when there was a knock at her door. A tall, vigorous village lad. His cheeks flushed from the sharp wind. He brought not only an armful of wood but also a bag of provisions donated by other villagers and a piece of salted pork. As he lit a roaring fire in the hearth, eyes of gratitude emerged from Agnes's wrinkled face. A warmth she hadn't seen in weeks seeped into her frail body. Such acts of generosity were very common around these dates. The rich and even the nobles were not devoid of compassion either. The local count's wife, Lady Margaret, was known for her aid campaigns during the winter months. Although her castle was well stocked, she insisted on sending wagons of grain, preserves, and food to the poorest peasants in her husband's territory. Some noble aristocrats laughed hard at this. Peasants were hardly better than animals. Why waste good food on them? They would say. But Lady Margaret was firmly committed to her Christian duty to care for the unfortunate, especially when famine hit a region. Lady Margaret worked with determination to stretch her castle's provisions. She ordered the cooks to prepare hearty soups and meals to distribute to the poor who came begging at the gates out of hunger. The kitchen boys grumbled at the extra work, but a fat man named Cook Werner shared his mistress's sense of noble obligation. He threw himself into the task. He filled the soup with the very last turnips and potatoes in the cellar. For some, this would be their only meal for days. As winter dragged on, even Lady Margaret's stocks began to run low. She had quietly begun selling her jewelry and ornaments to buy more supplies from neighboring towns. Her husband, the Count, respecting his wife's piety, chose to look the other way. Even though he worried that they too would be left vulnerable to hard times, she played a major role in helping those suffering in the church. Monasteries opened their doors to the poor and sick, offering a warm place to sleep and a basic daily meal of bread and ale. Some had even opened primitive hospitals to treat the frozen and desperate sick. The monks saw this as their holy duty. As a way to imitate Christ's sacrificial compassion, Brother William was a young person tasked with caring for the sick in the monastery hospital. Although the sights and smells of sickness and decay sickened his stomach, he forced himself to ladle broth into the mouths of the toothless elderly and change the pus-soaked bandages of infected wounds. He prayed earnestly for the strength to endure this ordeal and wished for God's position in his life to protect him from the worst ravages of winter. For winter was a great equalizer that mowed down rich and poor alike with its icy scythe. Of course, the rich could afford luxuries like thicker woolen socks and warm spiced wine. But still, they shivered in their drafty manners and worried about their dwindling supplies. death would return to them too in the form of disease born of winter. The noblewoman Lady Isabel was pregnant during a particularly severe cold snap. She was isolated in her confinement chamber. She had every comfort, a hearth, piles of furs, and attentive servants meeting her every need. But sickness finds a way to breach even the thickest castle walls. A kitchen maid brought Lady Isabel a posset made of warm milk and herbs. The expectant mother was burning with fever. Her lungs were afflicted. The child was born too early. It was a tiny thing that did not breathe. By the weekend, Lady Isabel was dead too. King Henry VI, a pious and gentle soul, lamented endlessly over the suffering in the terrible winter of 1433. Royal doctors prescribed cinnamon and ginger to ward off the cold. However, he still sank into a deep melancholy. Even if he stuck his hands into the roaring hearth, he couldn't get warm. Some whispered that this was God's punishment for Henry's weakness as a ruler. In reality, seasonal depression was an ailment that could strike any human, from the mightiest king to the lowliest peasant. When the days slowly began to lengthen and winter's tightly clenched fist finally began to loosen, people let themselves dream of spring and hope. They prayed that soon the earth would thaw and the first tentative buds would appear on the skeletal trees. The great wheel of the agricultural year could begin to turn once more. On the first Monday after Epiphany in the earliest days of spring, the medieval folk celebrated Plough Monday with great joy. It was a hopeful sign of future crops. Village men blackened their faces with soot for luck and paraded through muddy roads with their ploughs held high in their fields. They sang pleasant songs to wake the sleeping earth. Afterward there was dancing, hearty eating, and plenty of drinking. This was a promise, a covenant that the dark days of winter were past and brighter tomorrows lay ahead. The same eternal cycle played out everywhere in society. In the great halls of dukes and countesses, bards played a merry song and couples, blushing with the hope of a new year, threw themselves into a lively folk dance. The king, too, held a bountiful feast for his court. Even low-ranking peasants and their families felt a sense of relief as they headed toward their humble fields, tightly clutching the precious stored bag of seeds that meant a future full of promise. The unfortunate widow Agnes, on her deathbed, found herself ladling a stirring pot of boiling soup. Winter was brutal. It was hardly possible to deny this truth. It brought with it a host of miseries and hardships, from starvation to bone-chilling cold to the specter of death and disease. But it was also a time when the true resilience of medieval man and his communal spirit shone brightly. Looking into the bleak abyss of winter, they responded with generosity, courage, and even defiant celebration. They understood that winter was an inevitable part of the great cycle of life and that the best way to defeat the cold was to close ranks and endure in unity. The village huddled quiet and still against the assault of winter. Not as we imagine joyful feasts in cheerful and cozy castles adorned with holly and chirping with music and laughter. For the vast majority, winter was a time of bone-chilling cold, brutal hunger, and grim survival. The specter of winter starvation was never far away. With crops withered and livestock scarce, putting food on the table became a daily struggle. In a brutally cold winter in 1315, a medieval Englishman's harvest was cut in half by storms and freezing weather. Desperate peasants were reduced to eating the straw roofs of their huts and boiling the leather of their shoes. All the while, they were still forced to work for their supreme lords. Malnutrition weakened the body's defenses against winter illnesses. A cold could quickly turn into major life-threatening diseases. Influenza would spread like a scythe through villages, felling young and old as they shivered in their dilapidated shacks. Teeth chattering, medieval people would huddle against the cold in the relative warmth of shuttered houses. But this closeness and comfort came at a price. The smoky air, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, septic chamber pots, and dirty rushes, was a breeding ground for disease. In a house in Suffolk in the 14th century, 13 family members, from grandmothers to babies, huddled all winter in a single small smokehouse along with their small, weak chickens and sick dogs. When spring came, it was incredible that anyone came out alive. Disease wasn't the only danger lurking in the long dark nights. Fires were a constant threat in crowded wooden cities and villages. A single misguided spark could quickly turn into a raging inferno. It would greedily devour tightly clustered buildings and take lives. The Great Fire of London in 1212 began on a cold November night. It spread rapidly through the city's narrow streets. Water was freezing in the pipes. An estimated 3,000 huddled Londoners perished in the flames, and many more were left homeless in the icy grip of winter. Travel was especially dangerous during these freezing months. Roads turned into muddy quagmires, while blizzards blocked the way with snowdrifts. With daylight scarce, travelers risked losing their way and heading to a frozen grave. In 1311, Queen Isabella of England set out from Canterbury to London. As the winter twilight of the shortened day deepened, she lost her way, and the pregnant queen wandered helplessly until morning, weeping copiously from fear and exhaustion. The assault of winter was no less brutal for working animals. Horses and oxen grew weak on winter fodder. As they pulled logs and loads through knee-deep snow, the steam from their jaws misted in the ice-cold air. Frostbite, blackened limbs, ice-cracked hooves, and wheel spokes were all affected alike. But even in the bleak depths of winter, medieval man found particles of light. St. Stephen's Day, or Boxing Day as we know it today, was a show of charity and goodwill. Alms boxes in churches overflowed with offerings for the poor, while soldiers provided hearty meals to cold and hungry tenants. The tradition of the Lord of Misrule brought a spark of subversive festivity to the darkest days. A low-ranking peasant would be crowned as the jester and preside over merry rebellions full of drunkenness, role reversals, and mischief. It was a temporary subversion of the established order. Despite the deprivations and dangers, the hope created by medieval winters somehow persisted. The hope that the weak and sick would survive, that food would last until spring, that light and warmth would once again defeat the encroaching cold. Snow fell ceaselessly from an ash-gray sky, covering the countryside in a suffocating white blanket. Icicles hung like daggers from the eaves of peasant shacks and great manors alike. Day and night, burning hearth fires offered only brief, temporary relief from the piercing cold. Smoke from precious flames stung eyes and clogged lungs in the closed, stuffy air of mud huts. Bodies huddled together for warmth, humans and animals all together. The pungent smells of manure and unwashed flesh blended into a unique medieval winter perfume. However, for some, even this dubious comfort had become an unaffordable luxury. Scarce food stores had worn dangerously thin, and bellies grappled with constant hunger pangs. Many of the poorest subsisted on little more than coarse bread and thin porridge, praying to survive to see the spring. The specter of famine stalked every home. From low-ranking peasant to high-ranking lord, none could escape winter's deadly claw. Even monarchs crowned in stone castles that sucked in the cold and exhaled a relentless damp shivered under piles of furs. Royal households generated a need for vast amounts of firewood and provisions to survive the long winter months. According to one account, a Princess Manlyafa of Bohemia died of cold in her bedroom. Her death was a chilling reminder that wealth and status provided only partial protection from the elements. But for a peasant family, losing a loved one to winter's icy scythe was an event as predictable as it was cruel. Diseases and fevers spread very quickly in communities weakened by hunger and close quarters. The stale, smoky air of shacks and ubiquitous filth made them more vulnerable to diseases and infections. Medieval doctors could do little with their feudal treatments based more on superstition than science. Snowdrifts and roads treacherous with snow and ice greatly exacerbated winter's troubles. Only the desperate or reckless dared to venture far from the proper comfort of their homes during the darkest months. Traveling any distance was a great ordeal where one would put themselves in peril. Tithes and taxes, feudal lords forced to organize a campaign on snowy roads, provided supplies to the army stretched and worn in the cold weather. The winter of 1407 witnessed one of the most surprising military achievements in the Middle Ages. This was a spark actually born of the necessity of brutal winter warfare. The fearless Welsh rebel leader Owain Glyndwr faced off against the superior forces of the future King Henry V in the high mountain passes. Accustomed to the harsh conditions, Glyndwr's men lured the English into a trap amidst a blinding blizzard. Helpless in their heavy armor, the English ranks scattered and fled. Many froze to death. Glyndwr's stunning victory, won as much by winter as by Welsh martial skill, lives on in legends to this day. The winters of medieval Europe were frequently marked by famines that claimed countless lives. When the cold lingered and spring planting was delayed, food shortages multiplied rapidly. Notoriously, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a spark actually caused by an unusually wet and cold spring rotting the seeds in the fields of northern Europe. Over the next few years, successive crop failures drove a large portion of the population to starvation. In England, the price of bread skyrocketed to 20 times the normal cost. The poor began eating grass roots and even tree bark. Desperate scavengers dug up graves to cannibalize the dead. Misery was compounded by crime and disease as malnourished citizens turned to theft and violence to survive. A heartbreaking narrative from the Chronicles of St. Mary's Abbey tells the fate of a starving woman imprisoned for stealing a loaf of bread. The woman was pregnant and hungry, but the baker would not give her bread. So she stole a loaf and was caught as a result. The judges would not forgive her, so she was hanged. As she died, her baby fell from her womb before the eyes of the public. The child was screaming, covered in blood on the ground. But no one wanted to touch or save it, and the baby died shortly where it fell. The famine finally eased in 1318 when the weather became favorable again and crops began to grow. But the specter of hunger stalked the land every winter to gather a grim harvest at the slightest difficulty. For medieval people, winter was a time of intense unease, if not outright terror, while praying for meager food stores to last until spring. Malnutrition weakened the population, making them vulnerable to disease. The closed, unsanitary living conditions of winter were seen to lead to frequent outbreaks of infections like influenza and pneumonia. Respiratory diseases, in particular, took a heavy toll as they spread by coughing in stale, smoky air while people huddled around fires. In the Middle Ages, even a simple winter cold could quickly become fatal. It is known that Emperor Charlemagne died of pleurisy in the harsh winter of 814 after his doctors treated him with feudal ointments and dressings. Many historians think the Black Death of the 14th century spread so rapidly because malnourished citizens had no resistance to the disease due to gathering in winter quarters. In the winter of 1120, Matilda was on a ship called the White Ship traveling from France to England. The ship hit a rock and sank at a very high speed. It sent Matilda and hundreds of other passengers into the freezing waters of the English Channel. Matilda narrowly escaped drowning by getting into a small lifeboat. But then she asked for help for her half-brother William, who was still in the water. When the boat returned to pick up William, so many desperate people tried to climb inside that it capsized, plunging Matilda back into the cold waves. The young girl, pregnant with the king's first child, perished along with the others. It is said that her grieving father fainted at the news and never smiled again for the rest of his life. The very old and the very young were always in danger during the bleak winters of the Middle Ages. Even if they managed to survive disease and starvation, they could freeze to death in their sleep. Without the ice caps and glaciers we have today, winters in the Middle Ages were accompanied by severe blizzards and devastating floods. In 1216, King John of England was fleeing from rebellious enemies while crossing a marshy area and allegedly lost the crown jewels. John's baggage train was swallowed by the rising tide fueled by severe storms. The king allegedly escaped narrowly, but his treasure, including priceless jeweled crowns and scepters, disappeared into the turbulent waters never to be seen again. John died of illness a few days later, a broken man. Some historians think the loss of the crown jewels was the final blow that sent Hastings, sick, likely meaning the king/John, to the grave. Winter storms often meant disaster for coastal communities battered by hurricane-force winds and massive waves. The 6th century British monk Gildas paints a bleak picture in his work on the ruin of Britain. The nights are quite long and dark, the days gloomy and cold, the weather comes with evil. Icy blasts penetrate the bones. Everywhere is covered in snow and frost. A time of great suffering for man and beast. The whole world is dead and frozen, locked as if in the grip of a freezing hell. Especially for the elderly and weak, winter was a time of fear marked by a hopeless feeling that warmth would never return. People would wear every piece of clothing on top of one another and huddle together for warmth. But the cold would seep in anyway. Fires hiss and die in the damp, leaving behind only acrid fumes that sting the eyes and choke the throat. Coughs and sniffles were heard in the darkness, interrupted by the moans of the sick and dying. The cold turned breath to frost day and night and numbed limbs. In the Middle Ages there was never an escape from the grip of winter. There were no things like Florida vacations or cozy electric blankets to reduce the cold. The cold was a merciless companion that constantly drained the precious energy needed to survive. It was astonishing that the medieval world measured the passage of time not in months or years, but by how many winters one managed to survive. Reaching another spring was virtually a victory that became harder with each passing season. But somehow, despite brutal conditions, widespread disease, gnawing hunger and life-sucking cold, medieval people endured year after year from merciless winter to winter. They endured armored only with their own spirits. When the last good food stores ran out, they tightened their belts another notch. There was a poignant passage in the 14th century English poem Piers Plowman capturing the pure resilience of the medieval spirit. With sorrow and winter's bale, with frost and snow, it will all pass and peace will reign. The hopeful will win victories and never fail. Even in the darkest depths of winter, medieval folk found small joys and moments of grace. Neighbors shared what little they had with those who had even less amidst the cold and darkness. Some swore they heard the voices of angels in the howling winds at night, promising that warmth and light would come again. And so medieval people held fast to hope. Clinging fiercely to life, they fixed their eyes on the distant horizon where spring waited. They knew the sun would return, the snows would melt, and the world would be reborn green and magnificent as if winter had never come. All they had to do was endure, and they endured with a strength forged from the ice and stone of the season. The winters of the Middle Ages seemed brutal, merciless, and endless. They brought hunger, disease, ruin, and death. But they also brought out the best of the human spirit. They succeeded in coming together in unwavering will to survive, clinging tight to hope, in compassion and kindness. The medieval world was tempered in the icy crucible of winter and came out stronger. A little tougher, a little wiser. May their courage and indomitable spirit inspire your dreams tonight.